Have you ever walked into a room and felt like no one was taking you seriously? It's easy to point fingers, blame the environment, the people, the circumstances. But sometimes it's not them. It's how you show up. Because like it or not, respect isn't handed out freely. It's earned. And in today's world, there are certain habits that quietly strip you of that respect before you even say a word. Let's talk about one of the most overlooked ones, laughing at everything. Now, don't get me wrong, laughter has its place. It can be warm, inviting, healing. But when you find yourself laughing too often, too loudly, or at things that simply aren't funny, it doesn't come across as friendly. It comes across as insecure. You've seen it. Someone tells a mediocre joke, and someone else reacts like it's a comedy special. Not because the joke was hilarious, but because they're uncomfortable with silence. Because they want to be liked. Because they fear what might happen if they don't laugh. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When you laugh too much at things that don't deserve it, people don't see you as kind or polite. They see you as desperate, or worse, disingenuous. They may smile back, they might nod along, but internally they begin to categorize you as someone who's trying too hard. And that's a quiet social red flag. Think about it. The person who laughs at every joke, agrees with every opinion, claps at every story, doesn't come across as confident. They come across as someone who has no center, someone who adapts not out of openness, but out of fear. I once had a friend like that. Let's call him Darren. Darren was a genuinely good person, loyal, generous, kind. But being around him felt like you were always performing. You could say, "I tripped on the stairs today," and he'd erupt in laughter, like you just delivered a stand-up routine. At first, it was harmless, but over time, people stopped taking Darren seriously. Even when he had something meaningful to share, no one could hear it, because he had trained everyone to expect nonsense. And that's the price. When everything is funny, nothing carries weight. Your voice becomes background noise. Your presence, forgettable. People start to assume you're masking something. And most of the time, they're right. And I get it. Silence can feel awkward. Disagreement feels risky. Being serious makes you feel exposed. But here's the paradox. Respect lives in those very spaces. It's in your stillness, in the way you hold eye contact without flinching, in your willingness to let silence exist without rushing to fill it. There's nothing wrong with laughter when it's honest, but when it becomes a mask, when it's used to hide, to impress, or to blend in, it loses its purity. It becomes performative. People may not be able to explain why, but they'll feel it, and instead of drawing closer, they'll pull away. Because what people crave isn't endless agreement. It's authenticity. Someone grounded. Someone real. You don't need to be the loudest to be seen. You don't need to laugh the most to be liked. And you don't need to perform to be valued. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room holds the most power. Not because they demand attention, but because they don't need it. The less you laugh at everything, the more your laughter will mean something. It'll carry weight. It'll feel real. And people will notice. Not because you're trying to fit in, but because finally you're starting to stand out. Let's talk about another subtle habit that quietly chips away at your credibility. Overusing self-deprecating humor. Yes, being able to laugh at yourself is a sign of emotional maturity. It shows humility, perspective, and self-awareness. But there's a difference between laughing with yourself and constantly putting yourself down for others to laugh at. That line between humility and self-erasure, it's thinner than most people think. And when crossed too often, it sends the wrong message. Instead of looking humble, you start to look like someone with low self-worth. We've all heard it. I'm such an idiot. Classic me, messing up again. Why am I like this? At first, it might seem funny. It even makes people smile. But over time, it becomes less endearing and more uncomfortable because people eventually start to believe you. And here's the thing about humor. It's powerful. It creates connection. But it also shapes perception. When you constantly joke about your flaws, your awkwardness, your appearance, your mistakes, you're not just entertaining people. You're training them to see you through that lens. You're teaching them that you don't think you're competent, that you're not confident, that you're beneath them. I remember being in a meeting with a guy named Evan. Smart, talented, capable. But every time he spoke, he'd undercut himself. Sorry, I'm probably overthinking this. I'm not the sharpest in the room. Or, honestly, I'm just winging it as usual. People chuckled, at first. But eventually they stopped taking him seriously. They stopped expecting value from him because he told them not to. That's the hidden danger of self-deprecating humor. Over time, it erodes your credibility. And once people stop expecting you to add value, you'll have to work twice as hard to prove that you can. Here's the deeper truth. Most people who lean heavily on self-deprecation aren't just trying to be funny. They're trying to protect themselves. They figure, if I make the joke first, no one else can hurt me. If I lower the bar, no one can be disappointed. But that's not confidence. That's fear wearing a smile. And people can feel the difference. Worse, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you joke about your shortcomings, the more people associate you with those very flaws. And eventually, you start becoming the version of yourself you once exaggerated for laughs. Now let's be clear. Confidence isn't about pretending to be perfect. It's about being real, owning your flaws without letting them define you. The most respected people, leaders, creators, top performers, they do use self-deprecating humor, but they use it sparingly, strategically. They might say, yeah, my first project was a mess. But they follow it with how they grew, what they learned, where they are now. That's real strength, turning your missteps into stepping stones. So if humor is how you connect, that's fine. But check the motive. If you're using it to hide, to shrink, or to preempt rejection, people won't see humility. They'll see someone who doesn't believe in themselves. And it's hard to respect someone who's constantly playing the fool in their own story. You don't need to be flawless. You don't need to fake confidence. But stop disguising self-criticism as a personality. You're not being humble. You're making yourself invisible. So here's the shift. Use humor with wisdom. Laugh at yourself occasionally, not habitually. Speak with clarity. Own your strengths. Carry yourself with quiet self-respect. Because the way you talk about yourself teaches the world how to treat you. People will follow your lead, quietly, instinctively, because the world doesn't laugh at those who respect themselves. It laughs with them. 3. Talking too much, listening too little. We all know that person. They walk into a room and immediately take over every conversation. They monologue. They interrupt. They hijack your story and somehow make it about them. And at first, you might mistake it for confidence, but give it 5 minutes. That initial charm turns into annoyance, then boredom, then quiet, creeping disrespect. Why? Because one of the fastest ways to lose respect is by talking too much, especially when it comes at the expense of listening. Here's the hard truth. When you dominate a conversation, you're not really communicating. You're performing. You're not connecting. You're controlling. And people feel that. It doesn't matter how intelligent, passionate, or charismatic you are. If you never pause long enough to listen, people will eventually stop hearing you altogether. Worse, they'll stop trusting you. Because someone who's always talking is clearly not absorbing. And in a world where everyone wants to feel heard, someone who can't listen becomes a threat, not a leader. I had a colleague once, let's call him Ryan. Brilliant guy, Ivy League, always had something to say. But in meetings, he'd suck the oxygen out of the room. You'd raise a thoughtful point, and before you could finish, Ryan was already cutting in with his version. Over time, people stopped contributing, not because they had nothing to say, but because they knew Ryan wasn't really listening anyway. That's what happens when you make every conversation about you. People disengage, not out of disrespect, but because they're tired of being invisible. Here's the irony. Talking doesn't make you interesting. Listening does. Because when you truly listen, you make people feel seen. And that's powerful. In a world full of noise, someone who listens stands out like silence in a storm. They're remembered, respected, trusted. Talking gives us a sense of control. It feeds the ego. But listening, that takes strength. It takes humility, patience, and presence. Want to earn instant respect? Speak with intention. Listen with attention. Don't just wait for your turn to talk. Be present. Let people finish. Ask better questions. Let silence breathe. You'd be surprised how much people open up when they don't feel rushed or dismissed. Now, this doesn't mean you should become passive or quiet all the time. You should share your stories, your ideas, your voice. But know when to pause. Know when to invite others in. Because a good conversation isn't a speech. It's a rhythm. A give and take. The people who are most respected in any room aren't the ones who talk the most. They're the ones who listen the best. They speak when it matters. And when they do, people pay attention. That's the paradox. Talk less, and people will hear you more. Because your words aren't diluted by constant chatter. They land. They resonate. So next time you feel yourself taking over a conversation, pause. Ask a question. Really listen to the answer. And watch how everything shifts. People don't remember who dominated the conversation. They remember who made them feel heard. Respect isn't earned through endless words. It's earned through the wisdom of knowing when to speak and when to listen. 4. Never following through. Let's get one thing straight. People don't respect your words. They respect your consistency. They pay attention to the gap between what you say and what you actually do. And when that gap grows too wide, when you start making promises, plans, or bold declarations without delivering, people don't get angry. They just stop believing you. And when belief fades, respect goes with it. You become that person. The one who says, "I'm starting at the gym next week. I'll call you tomorrow. I've got something big I'm working on." But weeks go by. No change, no call, no update, nothing. It's not that people think you're lazy or dishonest. They just stop taking you seriously. Because your reputation isn't built on energy or excitement. It's built on patterns, not potential, not intention, execution. I knew someone like this. Let's call him Malik. High energy, charismatic. Always had a new idea, a new plan, a big project just around the corner. But every time we talked, it was déjà vu. I'm launching something soon. I'm writing a book. I've got this podcast dropping next month. But it never came. And over time, people stopped asking. Not out of malice, just quiet acceptance. Because promises without follow-through become background noise. And eventually, so do you. That's the truth. Respect doesn't come from what you say you'll do. It comes from what you consistently do. So speak less about what's coming. Do more of what matters. Let your actions speak, and let them speak clearly. Because trust is built in the small details. In the calls you said you'd make. In the gym sessions you actually showed up for. In the projects that didn't just get started, they got finished. Anyone can get excited. Anyone can make plans. But very few people follow through. And those are the ones we respect. But weeks turned into months, then years, and still nothing. No launch, no progress, just more talk. Eventually, people stopped asking Malik about his projects, not because they didn't care, but because they quietly accepted what his pattern had revealed. He didn't follow through. Malik had great ideas, brilliant ones even, but no grit. And in today's world, it's not ambition that earns respect. It's grit. The ability to stick with something when the excitement wears off. Here's what most people overlook. Every time you say you'll do something and don't, you're not just damaging your credibility with others. You're breaking trust with yourself. And that self-trust? It's the foundation of confidence. When you don't follow through, your self-respect takes a hit. Over time, it erodes. You stop believing in your own words. And deep down, a quiet voice starts whispering, "You don't really mean what you say." The people around you may never say it out loud, but they feel it too. They'll respond slower. They'll stop offering opportunities. They'll smile and nod when you speak. But behind their eyes, you'll see the truth. Sure, we've heard this before. Because the world isn't short on dreamers. It's short on doers. People who say less and build more. Who deliver without fanfare. Who follow through, quietly, consistently. If you want to earn respect, stop making promises you won't keep. Start under-promising and over-delivering. Say, "Let me get back to you," and actually do it. Say, "Give me 3 days," and deliver in 2. You don't have to be perfect, but you do have to be reliable. Because reliability is rare, and rare things are respected. Let's flip the script. Think of someone in your life who always shows up. If they say they'll help, they help. If they say 7 p.m., they're there at 6:55. You trust them, you admire them, even if you've never said it out loud. Now imagine being that person, the one people don't have to chase or second guess, the one whose word means something. That's quiet power. That's real respect. And it starts with one simple habit. Follow through. Next time you're tempted to talk big, pause. Ask yourself, am I actually ready to back this up? If not, don't say it. Because a broken promise does more damage than silence. At least silence doesn't lie. Follow through isn't about being flawless. It's about being dependable. And dependable people, they're the ones we hire, trust, promote, date, and admire. So say less, do more, and let your results speak louder than your voice ever could. 5. Being reactive instead of calm. There's a quiet power in staying composed. Not detached, not cold, just centered. But most people, they live in reaction mode. One comment, one tone, one delay, and they're spiraling, snapping, overthinking, shutting down, letting their emotions take the wheel. And what happens when people witness that? Respect evaporates. Because when you're reactive, it signals something deeper. That you don't have control over yourself. That your emotions run the show. That anyone, at any time, can push a button and get a performance. That's not strength. That's emotional vulnerability disguised as intensity. I knew someone like that. Jordan. Sharp guy. Tons of potential. But the moment someone questioned his ideas, he'd get defensive. Simple disagreements would explode into arguments. He couldn't handle feedback without hearing it as criticism. And over time, people stopped engaging with him. Not out of fear, out of fatigue. Because here's the truth about reactive people. No one wants to walk on eggshells. And no one trusts someone who can't stay composed under pressure. You could be the most talented person in the room. But if you can't stay calm when things go sideways, you'll never be handed the keys to real responsibility. No one hands over critical decisions to someone they can't trust emotionally. And that's the quiet reality of being reactive. It doesn't just cost you respect, it costs you opportunities. Because if people sense that your emotions can hijack the moment, they'll hesitate to bring you into the room where it matters. Not because they don't like you, but because they can't rely on you to stay composed when it counts. And reactiveness isn't always loud. It's not just anger. Sometimes it shows up as defensiveness, over-explaining, taking things personally, feeling the need to correct every misunderstanding immediately. Every time you react to something small like it's a personal attack, you're handing your peace over to someone else, letting the world dictate your internal state. And here's what the Stoics understood. He who angers you controls you. Let that sink in. If a comment, a delay, a tone, or even a look can ruin your entire day, then someone else owns your mood. And you gave them that power, freely. That's why calm people are quietly respected. Not because they don't feel, but because they don't flinch. They've trained themselves to respond instead of react. They walk into chaos and bring stillness. They don't raise their voice. They don't chase approval. They speak slowly, intentionally. They take the hit and stay centered, not out of passivity, but discipline. And that's what earns respect. Not performance, but presence. Because calm people can't be baited. They control the tempo. And in a world that's always shouting, the person who stays grounded owns the room. But don't confuse calm with passive. Staying calm doesn't mean letting people walk all over you. It means you know the difference between what deserves your energy and what's just noise. It's choosing silence over impulsive reactions. It's pausing before responding. It's taking a breath before jumping in. It's realizing not every slight needs a counterattack. Sometimes, dignity says more than 1,000 comebacks ever could. The calmest person in the room is almost always the most powerful. Not because they say the most, but because they're owned by nothing. Not their triggers, not their emotions, not anyone else's noise. If you want real respect, not fear, not sympathy, not compliance, train yourself to stay calm. Let your emotions serve you, not sabotage you. Because losing your cool might feel strong in the moment, but keeping it? That's where the real power lives. 6. Never taking accountability. If there's one habit that quietly drains your influence, it's this one: blaming everyone but yourself. People who never take ownership live in a constant state of defense. Their boss is always the problem. Their parents messed them up. Their ex was toxic. Their coworkers are jealous. Their timing is just unlucky. The list never ends. And after a while, it becomes clear. They're not victims of life. They're just avoiding the mirror. Here's the truth. Nobody respects a chronic blamer. Sure, people might offer sympathy at first, but sympathy wears thin. And eventually it turns into frustration. Because blaming others signals something deeper. That you're not in control. That you've handed the wheel of your life to everyone else. That you float, complain, and wait for something to change. And whether people say it out loud or not, they start to think, if you're always the victim, maybe the problem isn't out there. I once worked with someone like that. Let's call her Tara. Every time she missed a deadline, there was a story. The client changed the brief. The laptop crashed. The team didn't communicate. She was just overwhelmed. It never stopped. And over time, people stopped taking her seriously. Not because she lacked intelligence. She didn't. But because she refused to take responsibility. And here's the thing. If you never own your mistakes, you never grow. Accountability isn't just about earning respect from others. It's about building strength within yourself. When you own your choices, good or bad, you shift from passive to powerful. You stop being a passenger and start steering. You see your patterns. You learn. You adjust. And that's when people start respecting you, Because people don't follow those who point fingers. They follow those who say, "That one's on me. Here's what I'm doing about it." Not because they like being wrong, but because they're committed to growth. And let's be honest, people know when you've messed up. Trying to dodge, deflect, or dress it up doesn't make you look clever. It makes you look afraid. And fear kills respect. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to drop the ball. What's not okay is pretending you didn't, especially when everyone saw it happen. You'd be amazed how much credibility you can earn from just 3 simple sentences. "I dropped the ball. That was my fault. Here's how I'll fix it." That earns more trust than 100 excuses ever could. Because accountability makes you rare. We live in a time when calling everything toxic is easier than facing your own toxic habits. When being right is more important than being responsible. So when you step up and say, "I was wrong, I own it," you immediately separate yourself from the crowd. And in a world full of noise and blame, that kind of clarity, that kind of maturity, it gets noticed and it gets respected. It's also about taking ownership, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. That means choosing your response instead of blaming your reaction, choosing to grow instead of clinging to your past, choosing to apologize without excuses, and perhaps most importantly, choosing to live with integrity even when no one's watching. So if you catch yourself constantly pointing the finger, pause. Ask yourself, what part of this is actually mine to own? Even if it's just 10%, own it. Because blaming keeps you stuck. Accountability? That's where your power lives. Respect doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from being responsible, from being the kind of person who means what they say, does what they promise, and owns it every time. So stop blaming the weather. Stop blaming your childhood, your boss, your ex, your timeline. Start owning your life, one decision, one moment, one choice at a time. Because when you take accountability, you stop being a victim, and you start becoming someone others can rely on and look up to. 7. Bragging about everything. Let's be clear. Confidence whispers. Insecurity, it screams. And nothing screams louder than someone who feels the need to brag about their car, their salary, their gym routine, their dating life, their lifestyle, their followers. Every sentence starts with "I," and every story is a not-so-subtle attempt to impress. Here's the thing. It doesn't impress anyone. It repels people. Because bragging doesn't signal confidence. It signals a need to be seen, a need to prove, a need to fill a gap that true self-respect should already cover. I once met a guy at a networking event. Within 5 minutes, he was name-dropping, talking about closing a 6-figure deal, how he barely works anymore, how normal people just don't understand his lifestyle. He flaunted his watch, tossed around power names, tried to sell the image of success. No one said a word. No one argued. But slowly, people started drifting away. Not because he wasn't successful, but because he wouldn't stop talking about it. That's what many people don't realize. Real success doesn't need a microphone. It doesn't seek approval. It simply is. The louder you brag, the more people assume you're compensating. Because when you're secure in who you are, you don't need to convince others. You let your life speak for itself. There's a difference between sharing an accomplishment and bragging about one. Sharing comes from confidence and community. Bragging comes from comparison and insecurity. And people can feel the difference. Bragging shrinks the room. It makes others feel less. It shifts the energy from connection to competition. It's not, "Let's relate." It's, "Let me show you I'm better." That's why people tune out. They disengage. Because no one enjoys being in a conversation that feels more like a resume than a relationship. Now don't misunderstand. You should be proud of what you've accomplished. You should celebrate your growth. But you don't need to announce it like a teenager flaunting their first paycheck. True charisma is rooted in humility. And humility doesn't mean hiding your success. It means not needing to wave it around to feel valuable. Think about the people you genuinely admire. They don't brag. They radiate. They listen more than they talk. They offer value instead of seeking validation. They carry themselves with quiet confidence. They don't interrupt to one-up you. They don't need to prove anything, because their life already does. Want to impress people? Stop trying to. Let your character, not your voice, do the heavy lifting. The most respected people I know could brag endlessly, but they don't. Why? Because they're busy building. Because they understand that bragging is a cheap substitute for authenticity. And because the loudest in the room is rarely the one in control.